welcome to the 9th program in the 2MBS series, Bowing, Blowing and Beating, in which we hope to interest young children in the study of instruments. Rebecca Irving is speaking with horn player Lee Bracegirdle, who studied in New York and was principal horn in orchestras in Mexico and West Germany before coming to Australia as associate principal horn in the Sydney Symphony Orchestra in 1980.
Lee, is any one person more suited to playing the French horn than another?
Well, this actually is something that's been a point of contention for quite some time about the horn. They used to think that you had to have thin lips to be able to play the French horn. But this is nonsense, which they recently found out, because as long as you can fit your lips into the mouthpiece, you can train them to do whatever a horn player needs to do to play the notes. Otherwise, I would say that you need to be built fairly strongly. You don't have to be large, you don't have to be fat, but if you're small and very thin, you might have to work harder on the horn than other people might. However, that shouldn't be any reason to not play the horn if you like the sound of it. Basically, anyone who likes the horn and likes the sound of it can play it, and they have to have a good ear, because you need to develop the ability to pitch the notes in your head before you start playing the horn, before you play a note.
Where does the French horn get its name?
Well, unfortunately, the name French horn is an aberration. It really should only be called the horn, because that's what it's called in all other languages except English. It's called either the horn or the forest horn in every other language. And it's only the English who call it the French horn for some reason. I think maybe they thought that the sound or the tone quality reminded them of France, or they might have thought that the French developed it, which in both cases is wrong. It was actually the Germans who developed the horn as a hunting horn originally, and it's been used in all countries in England in Europe as a hunting instrument before it went into the orchestra. So it would be really nice actually if the English-speaking countries could eventually eliminate the word French from French horn and call it by its rightful name, which is the horn.
Well, you were talking that you said that it was a hunting horn. Now, in the olden times, they didn't have valves. So how did they make the different notes?
Well, that's right. All brass instruments began as instruments with no valves. So you had to get all the notes simply by changing the tension of the lips and blowing either harder or softer to get higher or lower notes. Now, of course, you could only get certain notes in what is called the Harmonic Series. Now, I'll just play for you the notes that you were able to get on a horn that would have been pitched in F as a hunting horn at the times when they didn't have any valves. Now that's a demonstration of the harmonic series or the overtone series of any instrument or anything that vibrates. If you take a string of a stringed instrument and bow it in its complete length, you will get the fundamental note of the string, which on the horn, on a natural horn, would be this. Now if you cut that string in half and bow it, you would get a fifth higher, which of course is the next note you would also get on a natural brass instrument. And if you cut that in half again, you get a fourth higher than that, which is an octave above the original note. And then if you cut that in half again, you get a major third above it. And as you get higher and higher, the intervals that you can receive become closer and closer together. And that's why in the orchestral pieces, the horns usually, when they had melodies, were played in the upper register of the horn, because that's where all the notes are closer together. And it was the same thing on the trumpets. If you played natural trumpets in Baroque orchestras, all the parts that are written for trumpets are extremely high, and that's why today trumpet players and horn players who have to play low as well as high have to work very hard to play these old Baroque pieces because they're written so high.
I would think that a lot of people would be concerned that having it wound around itself might affect the sound.
Well, any brass instrument is wound around because you have so much tubing that you have to fit into a small area, don't you? The horn is 6 meters long, and you'd be hard put to find an instrument case that would fit a 6 meter horn in it. You'd be hard put to find a stage that you could play it on.
So having it wound about itself doesn't affect the sound whatsoever?
Well, yes, it does. It does affect the sound, but that's one of the reasons it's wound around. Obviously, the trumpet and the horn have been wound around ever since they were invented, because that's how you fit that amount of tubing into an area that you can grab. But making the tubing in a circular fashion takes a bit of the directness and the edge off the sound. And since the horn has quite a few curves in it, has a lot of tubing curled up in a small area, that's one of the things that contributes to the roundness and the mellowness of the horn. Of course, the most important thing that contributes to the mellowness of the horn is the shape of the tubing itself. The French horn has what's known as a conical bore, which means it begins at a very small opening and very gradually opens up to an extremely large opening, as opposed to the trumpet or the trombone, which have what's called a cylindrical bore, which means that the opening at the beginning of the instrument, or say the difference between that opening and the bell size at the end, is not nearly as much. And you have a fast opening at the beginning, a very long cylindrical section, and then a bell section which isn't much larger. That's why on the trombone and the trumpet you get a brassier, straighter, brighter sound than you do on the horn or the tuba, because the tuba also has a conical bore.
Lee, with other brass instruments, perhaps particularly with the trumpet, 20th century music is affecting the way they're being played and being written for. Is this also happening with the horn?
Well, yes, it most certainly is. When you play Mozart symphonies or Beethoven symphonies, most of the notes that you have to play are in that harmonic series, with a few extra notes that couldn't have been got on the natural horn, which I'll demonstrate for you in a second. In order to get the notes in between the harmonic series, horn players have developed a technique of sticking the hand in the bell, closing it off completely, which makes a stop sound, and opening it to be able to get the notes in between the natural harmonic series. I'll demonstrate for you how you would play a normal scale, a diatonic scale, on the natural horn.
Now, is this similar? Would you consider that to be a muting?
Yes, well, they call it muting today, but when that was first developed by a man in Austria whose name was Tony, I forget what his surname was, Anton Hempel, I think his name was, that was the only way on a horn that you could get the notes in between the harmonic series. Now, the horn was also the only brass instrument on which you could do that, because the shape of the horn, when you play it, brings the bell back down towards the body so you could reach it with your hand. If you tried to do that to a trumpet, you'd have your hand way out in front of your face, in front of the trumpet, and you couldn't maneuver it quite as well. So that's why you were only able to do this on the horn. Now, as valves were invented, you were enabled to get all of the chromatic notes in between those harmonic series notes of the original natural horn, so they didn't have to use that stopping or muted sound anymore. I got all those notes. But this stopping sound was retained in the classical, romantic, and of course the 20th century repertoire as a totally different effect for the horn, which is called stopped. So you can now get that brassy effect of having your hand right in the bell and stopping off the sound, not because you need to get the notes in between, but because the composer wanted a particular effect.
Lee, we might hear you play something now. The piece you're going to play is...
That's the Bernard Heiden Sonata for horn and piano, and I'm going to play the last movement. So as you can see, contemporary music brings to the horn player a larger variety of styles of playing, but also of what you have to do on the horn. In the classical times, you merely had to get the right notes through changing the tension of the lips and maybe moving the hand in and out of the bell. But now, of course, with valves, you have to get all the notes in between, and the way composers are writing these days for the horn, you have to get them much faster. So there's obviously a lot more involved in learning how to play the horn. But I've always found, as you'll see in a few minutes, that you start with the basics, you start with the fundamentals, which are very much like the way the horn was played 150, 200 years ago.
Lee, we have a student of yours with us, and this is Peter Gunn.
Hello.
And you've been playing for how long?
7 years now. Yes, and studying with Lee for, 8 months.
Right. What approach, Lee, do you take when you are tutoring?
Well, I was brought up in a very traditional approach to the horn, and I think that it's very important to begin with the fundamentals of playing. When you want to teach someone, even if they've already been playing for a while, it's good to go back to the fundamentals when you start playing again every year, when you've taken some time off. But you begin, first of all, with the approach to attacking notes, to sustaining notes, to the right way of breathing. And I'll just begin, Peter, with a typical fundamental practicing study that you would use as a warming up exercise. Now I'm going to ask Peter to do an exercise which was invented by a man named Carmine Caruso, and this is what he calls the 6 notes, which is a series of long tones, 2 attacked and 1 breath attacked, and then a bar rest between each of them. Go ahead, Peter. A basic routine to begin with. This gets the lips vibrating and teaches you to always be placing the tongue in the right place to release the notes at the beginning of the day. Then I would normally ask them to play an exercise which, before getting into the high register, expands the middle and low register, because that's what you need to get the lips vibrating in a relaxed fashion. Now, Peter, if you'd mind playing the second exercise here, you can show them how we stretch from the middle register, which is easy to get, down into the low register. Okay, and here we'll stop and make an edit. Now take about an octave lower so they can show you how you continue down into the low register. Say start on low C. So as you see with this exercise, you will go right down into the lowest notes of the horn, so that for the beginning of the day and also when you're developing the lip in the first place, you have something to start with. Then I would ask the student to actually play exercises on the natural harmonic series of the natural horn, just as you would have had to in the days when there were no vowels in the horns. And what we do is we play the middle to the upper register and then back down into the lower register on one valve combination on the horn without changing the vowels. This gives the student a chance to develop the lip technique which is necessary to slur on a brass instrument without the aid of the valves. As you'll see, Peter, now if you wouldn't mind playing that with the second and third vowels on, which would be D flat major. And then I would make them do that in a few other keys in the same sort of area. You don't have to play it now. Which also gets the lips warmed up and gets them moving. Then I would also ask them to start playing a few scales in the staccato fashion so that we can start getting the tongue to be moving at a slightly faster rate. If you wouldn't mind just playing us a C major scale. Thank you very much. That's terrific. And in fact, Peter has just shown you a very large range of the horn. Now, to get the upper register started, then we will do slurred scales into the upper register. And then that scale would be repeated a semitone higher and a semitone higher and a semitone higher. And that way we've covered the whole register of the horn in a warming up exercise. Of course, a student would take him a while to be able to play that last exercise because you're getting into the register of the horn, which is not reachable when you first start buzzing your lips into a mouthpiece. You have to develop the muscles of the lips in a gradual fashion, and as I stressed before, it's very important to begin with the middle register, stretch it into the low register, and then begin working on the upper register. Then the student will have a solid foundation of playing. Then from there on, I would begin the students with some very basic studies written by many people, for instance Anton Horner or the Potag-Hovey methods, which begin with this sort of exercise but then get into playing folk songs or melodies that the kids would already know, so that they can hear what notes they're supposed to play before they play them, which is of course very important on the horn because you can be playing one valve combination and get notes that are right next to each other. For instance, I'll hold down first and second valve, and you'll see that if I aim for an A, I could end up hitting a B or a G instead. This is the A. But on the same valve combination, I can play or, which of course is a result of the natural harmonic series of the horn being so close together in the middle and upper register. Well, why don't we play something, Peter?
Sure. We'll play one of a set of 12 duets written by Mozart. Not particularly for the French horn. These duets can be played on any instrument. So here we go. 1, 2,
Thank you.
for that, for the duet. Peter, what would be your aspirations in playing the horn?
My aspirations with horn playing at this stage would be to broaden my personal playing ability in general, and also my knowledge of music as well. There's a lot to learn.
So would you like to play in an orchestra or in concert bands?
Yes. It takes a lot of preparation, though, to get to that standard.
So what age would you recommend that a student learns to play the horn?
Well, horn players start at all sorts of ages. The famous Dennis Brain began when he was 4, I think. My teacher, James Chambers, who was considered the greatest orchestral player, didn't begin playing, I think, until he was about 15. And I've also heard of people beginning when they were already 20 or just thereabouts. It depends on what type of musical background you have. If you've played another instrument first and then changed to the horn, you can start later. But I'd say if you want to play the horn, in other words, if you play the horn because you love the sound of it, that's the reason, you can start at any age. You only have to be big enough to be able to hold the instrument. They unfortunately don't make any quarter-size horns or half-size horns the way they do violins and cellos. So a student ought to be able to, if not sit the thing on his lap and play it, at least hold it up with his hand partway in the bell and hold it up to his mouth before he can play it. So I'd say any age between about 8 and 16 would be a good time to start playing the horn.
So would you recommend the French horn to young students?
I'd recommend it to them if, first of all, they can prove that they have a good ear, that they can pitch notes, because that's very important on the horn. I also would say that it probably is an advantage to have played another instrument beforehand, because then you can read music and you'll be able to know when you're beginning out on the horn and it's so difficult to pitch different notes. You'll know when you're playing the wrong note, or at least have a good idea if you're on the wrong track.
Just finally, Lee, how would you say the horn fits into music, the role of music?
Well, the horn has a range which does not go nearly as high as the trumpet and doesn't go quite as low as the tuba. It has a very large range. Basically, I could play about 4.5 octaves on it. But you fit in the middle of the orchestra. What the horn provides in the orchestra is the richness and the depth of sound. It fills out the tone quality of the orchestra. Nowadays, of course, horn players have to be able to play technically very good to play in the orchestra, and some of the orchestral parts are very difficult to play. You have to move around a lot on the instrument. But you couldn't possibly play on the horn the sort of dazzling, brilliant exercises in technique that a clarinetist or a violinist is called upon to play. So you don't provide that sort of brilliant quickness in the orchestra. You fill out the sound of the orchestra in the middle range, plus you provide the excitement, because all brass instruments have the dynamic range that none of the other instruments in the orchestra have. And the French horn itself has a great variety of tone quality. When you play softly, you have this round, mellow, rich tone, and when you play loudly, it gets very brassy. When you can get very brassy when you want to. So that's what the horn provides, is really the excitement and the tone quality in the orchestra.
Okay, well, I'd like to say thank you to both of you, to Lee Bracegirdle and Peter Gunn, for coming in and talking about the French horn.